Greetings, everyone. Daniel back again, and super excited to welcome Jordan Osserman to the program. Hello, my friend. How are you?
I'm very well. Thanks for having me, Daniel. Really excited to be here.
Yeah, we're here to chat about your research more broadly, and specifically your latest book. Congratulations on getting this book published with Bloomsbury. This is a Lacanian consideration, broader psychoanalytic consideration of circumcision, which we are all familiar with, and which actually has a really central place within Freud's thought, and is something that psychoanalytic thinkers comment on and philosophers comment on. Have really everyone has in some ways. So it's quite nice because the book is both a historical breakdown of like the introduction of kind of secular circumcision throughout the 19th century for rational cleanliness and things of that nature, and then it's also a work of Jewish studies. Do you have any background in the theological training in Jewish thought, Jewish studies, religious studies?
I don't really. That was probably the area that was the hardest for me to develop in the book. And as we were talking about before we began recording, this was initially a PhD dissertation. So basically, I spent a year of my research trying to immerse myself as much as I could in the worlds of Jewish studies and kind of Pauline theology, all of the debates and stuff in that field. I think there's probably a lot more for me to learn there, and I wouldn't consider myself an expert, but it is an area that I guess in a sort of autodidactic way I try to teach myself a bit about.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Obviously, that's something I want to raise with you. Some of those kind of intra-Jewish debates and how that intersects with early Christianity. We can talk about that, but I thought maybe we could begin by actually turning to psychoanalytic theory just to kick us off here. And I think that will resonate with our audience. We're a study groups on psychoanalysis and politics, and I think one of our mantras or one of our missions is to make psychoanalytic thought more accessible to broader audiences. And I'd like to, if we could, begin by asking the question, why is circumcision so central to Freud, actually? Like, could we start with the founder of psychoanalysis? And can you talk a little bit about how Freud saw circumcision?
Yeah, that's an interesting question, because I suppose what Freud would say and what interpreters of Freud would say are two different things. So for Freud, circumcision, I mean, it features in different places in his writing. There's a very famous, relatively famous footnote in the Little Hans case, where he posits that the unconscious root of anti-Semitism is to do with little boys hearing in the nursery about circumcision, and that they think, oh, the Jew has something cut off of his penis, and this makes him deficient. And he actually links this. So he says this is a kind of like castration anxiety fantasy that boys develop, that leads to anti-Semitism, and it's linked to the same kind of hatred of women, as to do with thinking of women as castrated. So one thing about circumcision for Freud is he offers a quite interesting kind of theory of prejudice and anti-Semitism, but then it also features quite heavily in Moses and monotheism, and this is probably where he has the most developed sort of theory of circumcision, as he refers to it as the key fossil to understanding the whole kind of fantastical story around the idea that the early Hebrews actually murdered Moses. And so he has this problem, which is the Jews claim that circumcision is this unique ritual that is what makes one a Jew and is what makes Jews stand out from all of the other religious or ethnic groups. But it's very well known, and it was known in Freud's time that ancient Egyptians also practiced circumcision. And so he's asking this question, like, why would the Jews claim that this ritual is unique to the Jewish race, quote unquote, when at the same time it was, in this kind of, in the story of, Moses freeing the Israelites from slavery, they were living in a society where circumcision would have been practiced by elites. And so he has this idea that there must be some kind of repression encoded in this, or something, there's a kind of clue to uncovering the fact that Moses was actually himself an elite Egyptian that was murdered by his initial followers. And then in order for those followers to atone for their guilt, they took on this ritual of circumcision as a kind of substitute for castration. And so then this is linked back to the totem and taboo story, and the idea that there's a kind of murder of the primal father, and the sons who murdered the father in order to atone for their and the father was someone who castrated the sons, and when this and the sons murdered the father and needed to atone for their guilt. So there's a kind of reproduction of totem and taboo with Moses and monotheism, and all of this kind of centers around circumcision as basically a symbolic substitute for castration, for physical castration.
So in a way, it's the repetition of the primordial crime that created the conditions. Because what does Freud's theory of the social contract actually mean? It actually means that from the murder of the father, the guilt emerges as a way of affectively creating a fraternity amongst,
exactly,
in this case, the brothers. But it doesn't have to be only thought of as a patriarchal society per se. Although I want to talk about sexual difference there as well. And I also want to invite you to say something about how Freud invents Oedipus in his break with Fleece, which you mentioned in the book, which I thought was quite interesting, and how actually, in a way, the circumcision theory that you just outlined as well, although that's talked about much later, how does it play into the Oedipus complex that Freud develops? Can you talk about that relationship, like conceptually?
Yeah, I mean, I suppose, as you were saying, it's a kind of it's a symbolic marker for Freud of law, essentially, of submission to a paternal prohibition of some sort. And so I guess he sees it in some sense as some almost kind of anthropological proof that the paternal prohibition needed to be kind of physically marked on the body. But of course, Freud doesn't think that the Oedipus complex or castration applies solely to Jews. Obviously, it's a universal theory for him. So it sort of functions in that way as a bit of historical evidence for his theory of the Oedipus complex, but not necessarily, you don't have to be circumcised to be subject to paternal prohibition. I don't know if that's kind of getting at what you're asking about.
Yeah, that's helpful. I guess it's a theory in a way also of initiating the subject into a community.
Yes.
And there's been a lot of different theories about its function. For example, you discuss Bruno Betelheim, who is a controversial but very interesting psychoanalyst who wrote a lot about circumcision. He wrote a lot about initiation societies, anthropology. He actually leans a lot more on Jung than he does on Freud in some of his theories. He kind of flips the Freudian script on circumcision in a 180 in a way.
Exactly. Yeah.
And in a way, for him, it is circumcision is about a kind of initiatory act, and obviously it is. There's no way around that. That's kind of almost one of its core functions in a certain sense. But perhaps could you speak a little bit about Betelheim's theory of circumcision for a moment, and as a point of contrast, maybe with the traditional Freudian view?
Yeah, I mean, I found this really intriguing, and I have to say, you opened up by saying a lot of psychoanalysts have written about circumcision. It was actually kind of news to me until I started researching, this subject. Just how many psychoanalysts have spilled a lot of ink on this subject, because if you don't kind of dig into it, you might see the topic come up here or there, but you might not realize that a lot of people really think there's something important to say about this. So in an introduction to the book, I look at I compare primarily Theodor Reich's work on circumcision with Bruno Betelheim. Theodor Reich has a fairly traditionally Freudian take on the matter, but he does a bit more anthropological research and more or less finds, in his view, evidence that circumcision is a ritual intended to is designed for fathers to kind of invoke fear in their sons and establish the incest prohibition, and prohibit them from sleeping with their mothers and creating a kind of community of men bound together by this prohibition. Betelheim, as you alluded to, kind of flips the whole theory on its head, and his what inspires him to do this is a very peculiar situation that he observes. So he runs this kind of school for disturbed children. And of course, there's lots of subsequent people have raised a lot of questions about what was going on at that school and whether there were various abusive practices involved there. And there's some big questions about Betelheim's practice. But nevertheless, he observes a group of children, of boys, who decide with the urging of some of the girls in this group to basically attempt to circumcise themselves or to mutilate their penises. And this raises questions for him about why would a group of children decide to kind of undertake this strange ritual act all by themselves without, the urging of a parental figure. And from this, he then kind of looks at anthropological literature as well. And he offers this idea that circumcision should be understood not necessarily as something that's kind of handed, forced upon like boys from up high from their fathers, but actually that there might be something in the id that's kind of gratified by this process, and particularly because it offers boys some kind of symbolic access to experiences of femininity that they feel barred from or that they're excluded from. And he focuses particularly on the blood that's involved in circumcision and how it's often ritually linked to menstrual blood. And he has a lot of, he develops this theory of womb envy, which is like the counterpart to penis envy. And it's this idea that basically men and boys envy the kind of quote unquote mysterious powers of femininity, and particularly the power to give birth. And circumcision is one of the ways that they ritually try and sort of appropriate or gain access to these powers. And so there's the menstrual blood that's involved. And then there's also just the kind of the initiatory aspect of it, the way in which, a boy in many cultures becomes a man through being circumcised, often by a male figure, is seen to be a way of kind of taking over, a woman's capability to conceive and give birth to a child. It kind of gets transferred over into a masculine domain where like the father now has this initiatory or like almost child giving power. And that's done through this act of circumcision. So that's his kind of flipping it on its head into circumcision basically being about men and boys dealing with this problem of womb envy.
Yeah. So yes, that's interesting, because in seminar 18, Lacan positively references Bruno Bettelheim and symbolic wounds and elevates his insights there as broadly offering something worth understanding about subjectivity, particularly, I think it was psychotic subjects within the clinic. The argument there was that even for psychotics who are deprived of a social bond, they are mutilating a part of their bodies. And this shows a kind of, like you said, a kind of connection to a theory of initiation through the id, I guess you could say. That's very fascinating. And we can return to Bettelheim and but that, okay, so moving out from that, that's quite nice. So you've talked about the traditional Freudian view, Theodor Reich, Bruno Bettelheim. Let's turn to Lacan himself, because you're primarily a Lacanian, which is great. And and obviously Lacan has quite a lot to say apropos castration. And I think maybe we could begin this for the benefit of people listening and so on, or watching on YouTube. Why does psychoanalysis place such a huge onus of importance on the castration question? Like the rock of castration, the necessity for subjectivity in analysis to passage through castration. It kind of sounds like, okay, you psychoanalysts, we get it. You want us to face this, like, calm down, everybody. But I mean, symbolically, obviously, the act of circumcision is like for many of us, it's the first true castrating moment that we have as our introduction, and it's a traumatic thing. I mean, a brief personal aside. I decided
I always welcome the personal asides on this subject because people always have fascinating stories to add here. But yeah, please.
I decided not to circumcise my son. I decided not to do so, not out of any ideology or religious belief. I'm broadly a Christian person. I was circumcised, but I just felt that it was necessary as an experiment to see if this could be deferred, if this for him, that I wanted to not impose this injunction, and just and that's it. I just kind of left it there. So there's not really a story there. It's just that's what I chose to do. And then later we're going to talk, Jordan, about there's actually a whole political movement of people today, kind of postmodern culture, insisting against circumcision.
Yeah.
So let's go back to castration. Can you outline what it is, first of all, why it's important, and maybe talk about its linkage to circumcision?
Yeah, I mean, I think the first thing to say about that is, of course, castration was hugely important to Freud and his early followers, and it, featured very heavily in the debates in the 1920s. But actually, when you say castration is important to psychoanalysis, it does really depend which psychoanalysts you're speaking about, because it was really, I mean, Lacan is often credited with kind of bringing castration back into the picture after a lot of psychoanalysts thought, maybe Freud emphasized this stuff a bit too much. It's a bit nutso. And so I think Lacan and the sort of French tradition, because I would say also Laplanche and others, brought castration back into the picture. And why they did that is, I think, essentially this idea that a kind of foundational experience of lack is what constitutes the subject, right? That's the kind of Lacanian position. And that is essentially, I think, what he means by castration. And for Freud as well, although he explains castration in what Lacanians would probably consider more imaginary terms, it's a similar idea. So that, Freud's idea of castration is essentially that at a young age, both a boy and a girl have to, they encounter this idea that there is either the reality of not having a penis or the threat of the penis being chopped off or not being there. And they encounter this through this sort of subjectivizing Oedipal situation where they sort of realize who they are in relation to the mother and the father. And this is a kind of historical moment that establishes something about law. So for the boy, there's the possibility that the penis might be lost or might be cut off if he, violates the incest taboo. And for a girl, there's, according to Freud, kind of dealing with the reality that, the penis isn't there, and the sort of more complicated consequences of that. And that's why he has this whole theory that women don't have a superego, because they don't really have to fear the threat of castration in the way that boys do. So they don't really have this sense of guilt that supposedly boys do. A quite problematic theory, but nevertheless, that's what it is. So yeah, that's Freudian castration. I think it was quite important for Lacan to reformulate that in more structural terms and talk about it more as a kind of foundational lack linked to language. Although at the same time, and in a way, this is where circumcision comes in, what I'm trying to do in the book is understand how do we put these Freudian ideas about the penis and the penis falling off or being cut off and all of this stuff, how do we put that side by side with these structural Lacanian ideas? And like, what's the relation between the two? Why do we even call it castration in the Lacanian version? Like, what's it got to do with the genitals? And my wager, I guess, is that if we look closely at circumcision and all of the different rituals, significations of it, and different ways we can understand what it means, we might be able to understand what this structural idea of castration has to do with the genitals and with sort of childhood development and with all of that stuff.
That's amazing. That's a great summary. So in a way, the heart of your thesis is that, and I want to actually introduce the question of sexual difference here, because I think that that's one thing we haven't discussed. But you write that you arrive at a theory that the question of circumcision has to do with the resolution of a certain ambivalence at the heart of it. Can you talk a little bit about the theory of ambivalence that's at play there, and how it links up with the question of sexual difference, which is, of course, at the cornerstone of psychoanalytic thought, especially for Lacan?
Yeah. So what I am trying to do there is basically trying to understand how is it that people can see circumcision as something that is, some people can see it as something that is a kind of masculinizing ritual or procedure that kind of initiates you into manhood. And at the same time, people can also see it as something feminizing. And so there's real concrete historical examples of this. There's a long history of Jews being portrayed in anti-Semitic stereotype as feminized precisely because they are circumcised. And actually, I mean, there was a very sort of graphic and difficult, upsetting kind of situation going on in Kenya between these two tribal groups that were at war with each other quite recently, in which they were, one group was practicing forced circumcision on the other as part of this tribal warfare. And it was just another kind of historical example of this. That group themselves would circumcise men as part of an initiation procedure and saw that as what makes you a man. Yet at the same time, they subjected their enemies to circumcision and understood that as a kind of way of castrating them or feminizing them. So the reason I bring that up is to say, you see this kind of weird circumcision as both masculinizing and feminizing seems to occur side by side in different, historical cases. So when I refer to the ambivalence of circumcision, I'm basically trying to theorize how is that possible? And the answer I reach is that in some sense, circumcision embodies this ambivalence or this paradox about castration itself, which is this idea that on the one hand, the procedure is kind of subjects a male subject to some form of lack, but precisely in order to initiate him into a community of men. And so it's a kind of phallicizing ritual. And perhaps it might have something to do with trying to deny or disavow lack. So, you kind of get subjected to lack, you lose something, but you gain something as well. Or you could also see circumcision as just being about that first bit, as a kind of subjection to lack that involves a kind of openness, opening to otherness, however you want to put it, and that there might be something kind of feminine encoded into that. It's really tricky when you use this gendered language, because I don't want to kind of play into essentializing gender tropes. But there you have it, that there's these kind of two ways of reading what circumcision does, and you could kind of read those along masculine or feminine lines within psychoanalytic theory. That's what I try and do with this idea of ambivalence.
Amazing. Yeah, it's extremely complex and I kind of think a nice social cultural example of an initiation. One question I have, Jordan, is how do you theorize female circumcision? Not the FGM debate, which we can have, and which I think in feminist thought is a huge, huge, huge topic. So we can chat about that. But I actually was more interested if we could take a step back from that for a moment and think what initiatory rite might function on a similar wavelength of significance for women if the majority of women, as you know, as we know, are not circumcised. So
Yeah.
how does that function? What is their initiatory? I know that's kind of a naive question, but I think naive questions are good.
I agree. I mean, and I don't really have a satisfactory answer to it. I mean, Levi-Strauss writes about it. One thing that's important to note is that in almost every society where female circumcision or FGM or whatever you want to call it, in almost every society where that's practiced, male circumcision is also practiced, although it's not necessarily the other way around. So there are lots of groups that practice male circumcision, but not female circumcision. So Levi-Strauss and other anthropologists have said they've interpreted these rituals as often as to do with essentially removing the part of the body that in some sense resembles the opposite sex, so that for girls, female circumcision is about removing the supposedly masculine part of the vagina, and that for boys, circumcision is about removing the supposedly feminine part of the penis, and that these are rituals that essentially establish sexual difference through ritual because it's not established sufficiently in a biological way. So that's the kind of Levi-Straussian reading. I think, one very speculative thing you could say is, Freud's idea that the boy fears castration and the girl doesn't because she is already castrated. You could posit that maybe the fact that there are lots of groups that only practice male circumcision and not female circumcision has some resemblance to that idea, that there's something, that needs to be established for boys that doesn't necessarily need to be there for girls.
Do you believe that?
I put it in very speculative terms.
Rather, maybe we could say it like this. What might be the implications of holding that position? Because I feel like to hold such a view has a kind of normative function around a phallocentric social order, doesn't it?
Yeah. And I think actually maybe the way I would put it is that patriarchal societies kind of might hold that view and function in that way, and they reproduce patriarchy at
why are you skeptical? You sound a little skeptical there. Why are you kind of not sure about this? It seems pretty clear cut. I mean, doesn't it?
Which bit seems clear cut?
That this is a elementary definition of how we might understand a sunk feature of patriarchal societies.
Yeah. No, I think that bit is true. I guess what I was hesitant about is the idea that there's something more universal about human nature that we could, posit, that I don't want to offer a normative reading of this, right? I want to be clear that I think this is how patriarchy establishes itself, but this isn't necessarily how humanity has to establish itself.
One primordial or early way that it does. I think there's a lot of other ways.
Yeah, exactly. So we should keep delimiting and specifying, but yeah, exactly. That it is one way that patriarchy kind of sets itself up.
Fair enough. Yeah. Brilliant. Let us make a pivot now to the Jewish rationale, the theological rationale, the Abrahamic religions. We can talk about Christianity later adopting it and so on, and how that process works with St. Paul and all of that. But given that the Jewish faith is the first in the big three, tell us the story of how the rabbinic tradition, the Torah, and so on gives, or how God mandates circumcision. Just tell us that snapshot, please.
Well, God commands Abraham this is the kind of founding covenant of Judaism, that all sons shall be circumcised on the 8th day after they're born. there's not a lot of justification given for it in the Torah itself. And this is probably precisely why there's so much rabbinical writing about what it means and why it has to be done, because it's kind of this bizarrely, I mean, many, biblical commandments are sort of just delivered, but it's one of those. It's just, this is the thing that marks, the covenant between God and man. What I go into in the first chapter, I believe, of the book is some of the quite interesting ways that the rabbis, and particularly after the founding of Christianity and after St. Paul, really make circumcision completely integral to what it means to be a Jew, and see it as this kind of this marking of divinity on the body that has to be performed in this very fleshy way, in order to sort of truly, create this linkage between man and God. And I talk a bit about how it seems like that's actually a reaction or a response to St. Paul offering this idea that circumcision could be thought of as in a kind of metaphorical way, as a sort of, has a spiritual meaning, but doesn't necessarily need to be practiced literally.
Yeah, that is really fascinating. And I like your section on St. Paul. I mean, I think in continental philosophy circles, St. Paul and the turn to St. Paul has been huge ever since Giorgio Agamben and Alain Badiou, who you write about, and Boyan, is it? I was less familiar with Boyan.
Yeah, Daniel Boyarin. I was thinking,
Boyarin.
I mean, it's a funny chapter because Daniel Boyarin would be well known to kind of people in, I don't know, the quite small world of Jewish queer studies, but also Jewish studies. He's probably he's not so big in the world of continental philosophy, but he did happen to write this book.
I've never read his work. Yeah.
So, but he wrote this book about St. Paul at the same time that a lot of these other continental philosophers are writing about St. Paul.
So let's talk about the Paulinian, the kind of this wonderful chapter. I think it's a quite rich and theoretically interesting chapter in your book, between reading Badiou and this figure Boyarin. Can you first start off by just laying down the stakes of your argument in this section of the book, and then kind of giving us the overview of where you come out the other side? So run us through this interesting set of comparison here.
Yeah, this was, so when I said I spent a year trying to, learn what I could in terms of the relevant theology and stuff, it was really while pursuing this chapter. And there was something a bit mad about it, I have to say, because I kept finding all these connections between what I was reading. And, it just sort of, there was an intensity to this chapter that I think as I kind of worked on the other bits, I was able to, I don't know, be a bit slower in my approach. But basically, so you have this this scholar, Daniel Boyarin, who has written a lot in the kind of world of queer studies and Jewish studies, and he argues that St. Paul is the kind of, in some ways, the first, you could sort of like, almost like the first Bernie bro, if we use that kind of language.
You did not use that in the book, though. I think
I don't think Bernie bro was in circulation at the time I was writing this, but that's
maybe as a footnote you could have said that as a...
yeah, exactly. And I don't like really the term hilarious. Bernie bro. I don't really believe in it, but that's kind of what he's saying, is that St. Paul is this dude who decides that what really matters for the kind of new movement of Jesus followers that aren't yet exactly Christians, is the kind of higher meaning of circumcision, but not the physical rite. And he argues that this is a kind of like Platonic rejection of the body. And I guess I would say it's in the same way that, people accused Bernie supporters of being kind of economic reductionists who don't see the importance of identity, and they just kind of focus on this, higher pursuit of class struggle. That's the kind of parallel I'm trying to make. And so he develops this long argument about this. And then you have Badiou, who basically argues, like St. Paul is the foundation, offers like a foundational practice of universalism that is exactly akin to how Badiou theorizes universalism, and he thinks it's great. So partly I had this political interest in like this divide between those who really want to emphasize particularity and historical situatedness and all of that stuff, which I see as kind of what Boyarin is doing through St. Paul, versus a kind of universalist anti-identitarian approach, which is what Badiou is doing through St. Paul. So that was kind of what got me interested in the chapter, is this really kind of interesting porousness between these political concerns and these sort of theological concerns and these philosophical concerns, all in this, in these two perspectives that really felt like they were on opposite ends of the same pole. Although these two authors, they published their books in the same year, but they didn't cite each other or have any conversations with each other about these issues until many years later.
Oh, so okay. So the circumcision of the heart motif of Paul, so it's compelling. I mean, it's an interesting idea. I mean, the idea is both isolating circumcision as an extremely significant rite within the faith experience as such, but it's also elevating it beyond the corporeal, and it's putting it into the spiritual and so on.
And that's exactly it. It's like both of these authors, it's all about what do you make of this idea of circumcision of the heart as a replacement, or circumcision of the heart as more important than circumcision of the flesh, which is essentially what Paul is saying.
So in a way, you could say that for Paul, the affirmation of the truth of Christian, of the cross, of the event of Christ, is it kind of like Paul is making that homologous to the centrality of circumcision? He's saying, like, there's this circumcision thing, and we almost need to treat our orientation to the Christ event at the same level of seriousness, but we need to incorporate it into our heart, into our spirit, and so on. Is that kind of one way to think about it broadly?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, interestingly, there are lots of Paul theologians who say, the flesh actually matters a lot to Paul, and this would really go against what Boyarin is saying, because actually, if you read Paul's letters, there's all kinds of really gory stuff about the resurrection, right? So there's a lot of bloodiness in Paul as well. But one reading of Paul is that circumcision of the heart is a spiritual signified of circumcision of the flesh, which is the signifier. But that and this is Boyarin's reading, that spiritual signified can be experienced in some way without that signifier of circumcision of the flesh.
Yeah. So I guess it's interesting to go back to the Burning Bro thing, in the sense that it depends on how we're theorizing negativity, as I would say it. Because in reality, the birth of universalism of Paul, in a certain sense, in my own framework here, would have to do with the fact of the negation of given particulars, the given particulars of one's family, of one's nation, of one's identity, etc., etc. These kind of finite particulars, these kind of everyday particulars. And of course, there's all of these phrases that Paul is quite fond of quoting and so on, about the necessary renunciation that Christ imposes to follow a different law than the law of what's on offer. That then is the birth of the universalism, in that negation. And that's how I kind of would summarize Badiou's theory in a way.
Yeah, absolutely.
How then, since I'm less familiar with Boyarin, how then would you summarize that difference? Because here the emphasis is actually on a different, it's not really a theory of universalism. Is that right?
No.
Yeah. So
he's quite skeptical of universalism. I mean, I think you gave a perfect summary of the Badiou theory of subtractive universalism, is another term that's used for it, as this kind of negation or renunciation of these positive attributes. But basically what Boyarin thinks, and I think this is true of a lot of people on the more identitarian left, or whatever you want to call it, is that whenever someone claims to be a universal, they might say this nice stuff about negation, if they do at all, but really what they're doing is they're picking some particular, and they're elevating it to the status of the universal in a kind of bad faith attempt to claim that something is universal, when really what they're doing is saying, essentially the white Eurocentric male is the universal, although we're not going to fully admit to that. And so so it's a critique of universalism. It's not really a theory of universalism.
Right, because in that mode of the negation of the particular is never going to be adequate, because in a certain sense what's going to happen is the privileging of a particular in the act of supposedly transposing it into something they call the universal.
Exactly. Yeah.
My question would be, okay, that's great. I think this is really good for listeners to kind of get a hold on this, because this is really complicated stuff. My question would be, like, the Boyarin view, what are the conditions which prevent universalism, or like, why is universalism inefficacious ultimately? Like, why is it kind of fraudulent, right? Like, there's something fraudulent here. You're supposing something is universal when in fact you're not. You're duping yourself and everyone else by elevating this particularity. That kind of goes back to the Bernie Bro thing as well. But I guess my question is, like, where does the fraudulence emerge? Does it emerge on the fact that the subject can't get out of certain, like a phallogocentric thing, that is it something like that? Is it constricted like that? Or are there other rationales for how this, what I'm calling fraudulent universalism, like why is universalism destined to be fraudulent?
I think what someone like Boyarin would say is, as soon as someone has the idea of declaring that something is true for all, then automatically they're elevating some particular thing into a universal that isn't going to be true for all. And what they would offer as an alternative, and what Boyarin offers as an alternative, is this kind of complete immersion in the particular, as in some sense, he doesn't say it, but he's almost kind of suggesting that there's something more universalistic about that. And so, his study of rabbinical Judaism is essentially a study of how, through the Jews' participation in all of the rituals of Judaism, circumcision, being at the center of it, and the kind of intertextual tradition of Judaism, in which all of the different kind of, like all parts of the Torah are a kind of self-glossing text, that there's this kind of full immersion in one's historical circumstances, which is also an embodied immersion, which is somehow a more perhaps authentic way to live, but also kind of more open to otherness and to the neighbor. I mean, there's a lot about the neighbor in all of this, than this attempt to say, I've figured out the truth and this is the truth for all. And so I do think in some sense there are some universal pretensions to these kind of anti-universalist positions, but they're never really able to fully articulate them.
Yeah, that's brilliant. So this is live wire like philosophy in a way, because I'm curious if you feel resolved in this debate yourself, like stepping away from after having written this, we can already see, we can already see the implications for a lot of other questions in our social political lives that comes out of this debate. And that's actually what Paul did for philosophy for that decade that Paulinian studies was at the center of continental philosophy. Is I think that the meaning actually helped us make a bridge to these other, like, more practical questions of identity, of gender, of race, of class, etc., 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 solidarity, and so on. Okay, where do you fall on this today? Like, do you feel, where do you fall on it?
I mean, I think I like how you put it, because I probably was working something out about my own politics through writing this chapter. And I've become much more of a kind of Trotskyist Marxist in the years since working on that chapter. And I do very much fall, on the side of in defense of Badiou in some sense, but also with some appreciation for the real danger of false universals, of the, the ways in which people can, in bad faith claim that something is universally true when they're really promoting a particular, like
Absolutely.
white agenda or whatever it is.
Sure.
So yeah, I mean, I'm a staunch defender of universalism, but also I think there are important critiques to be made about some of the dangers of not being, sufficiently critical about one's universalism.
And what do you think that calls for? Because I think it calls for an ethics. Like, I think that question, like from ambivalence to ethics, like you have a political question, it's not immediately resolvable within politics alone, which is why I feel that it calls for an ethical question on like the proper treatment of universalisms.
Yeah, well, I mean,
You know?
going back to me saying I've become more of a Trotskyist, I mean, it calls for engaged struggle, right? I mean, you have
That
to
too. Yeah.
actually
Yeah.
live a political praxis, which I think is also involves an ethics in which you come up against the stumbling blocks of your universalism, and
Right.
you, through that process, figure out how to expand it.
Yeah, Trotsky did write a book called Their Morals and Ours.
Yeah, exactly.
And then of course we're introduced to this whole question of which I've been talking a lot about with people on the podcast, of Schmidt, because I think, actually, not to go too far off track, we're gonna return to the book, don't worry. But one of the interlocutors that the question of St. Paul, when he was at the center of continental philosophy, was Carl Schmitt as well.
Yeah.
And I felt like, Carl Schmitt defines what elevates to proper politics is when you have the friend-enemy distinction established, and this really antinomous kind of, agonistic theory. And in a Marxist vein, yes, there is this question of struggle, but I think where we face challenges there is actually delimiting where the enemy starts and where the friend begins. Like, that whole thing, in a certain sense, becomes a bit of a tricky quagmire, especially in the spaces of, like, liberal institutional academic nonprofit life. It's quite mercurial, but that's a whole other thing. So let's return to the book and actually ask you now.
Yeah, I don't mind the Schmidt reference. I do have a paragraph or two about Schmidt, so I waded into him as well.
Yeah. I mean, because that's actually one of the interesting things I've been looking at, is kind of like new Marxist, and this is the side, I promise, new Marxiological ways of reading the history of philosophy that have actually been opened up to me by my reading of Georg Lukács, because Lukács was one of the first Marxist philosophers who really created a new historical materialist methodology of reading the history of philosophy in his book called Destruction of Reason. And Domenico Losurdo will refine that methodology even further, and in a way it gives us a new way of how to properly treat ideas within struggles. Like, we'll understand the historical social context in which concepts and ideas emerge, so that when the continental philosopher speaks about a thinker like Carl Schmitt, without referencing the fact that he's a Nazi, without referencing the fact that he's the main jurist of the Reich, the Third Reich, or one of the main, the fact that we can do that, the fact that we can neutralize his corpus of ideas, is a very strange disavowal. It's a very strange disavowal that we do with ideas.
Right. Just one thing I would say about that. I mean, the friend-enemy distinction, Carl Schmitt's, this is the foundations of politics for him. You could see that as at play in Marxist politics, because there are the proletariats and the capitalists. But I think the key difference is, of course, that the aim of Marxism is the idea that the proletariats are in fact the universal, and it's for everyone to become the proletariat class, right? To eliminate the capitalist class, not solely through genocidal murder, but actually to create the conditions in which there are self-rule by workers. And that's not part of Schmitt's agenda. There will always be a friend-enemy distinction, right?
Correct.
And I think that is how you at a philosophical level appreciate a sort of fundamental difference between a fascist way of thinking about how a society is divided and a communist way. is around this,
For sure.
universalism.
For sure. Yeah. That's helpful. I mean, I think the question of left Schmittianism is real, and there's a lot of the question I would ask is, what are the limits of finding in the concepts of a fascist thinker the unbeknownst to yourself reproduction of, like, in a way it has to do with the ethical treatment of a political concept. And this has been a huge interest of mine. I'm writing a book right now on this, in part on Nietzsche, because if Nietzsche's concepts were designed to be taken up by thinkers in the future to further a specific political project, what does that mean about how we work with his ideas now? Does it mean anything? Or can we kind of analytically, kind of circumspectly kind of just work with them? So anyways, that's a whole other thing for us to discuss. Let us now ask you the question regarding how modern capitalism has dealt with the introduction of circumcision through the kind of biomedical, rationalist, not rationalist, but rationalization in a Foucauldian sense. How did that come about, especially in the 19th century? Like, what's the history of secular circumcision and the power discourses that went into that?
Yeah, so this is a really interesting subject. It's a favorite topic of people who are really against male circumcision, kind of in an activist way. Because basically, most Americans are familiar with the idea that circumcision is hygienic. There's, nowadays there are quite a few studies showing that it might confer some protection against various STDs, all of that kind of stuff. But the actual origins of the procedure as a medical procedure, as opposed to solely a religious or ritual one, date to the late 19th century, and to this, to a group of doctors who subscribed to this kind of medical paradigm called reflex theory. So the idea was that irritation in one part of the body could generate disturbances in another distant part of the body. It was kind of based on the theory of the reflexes, but expanded to explain all kinds of diseases, and has all kinds of interesting links with hysteria. And basically, they had this idea that the foreskin was a potential source of irritation, and that it could cause all kinds of disturbances to other parts of the body and could be responsible for all manner of kind of symptoms and illnesses, from things like seizures and paralysis to bedwetting and insomnia and a whole range of symptoms. And there are these interesting papers that I dug through of doctors basically purporting to perform these medical miracles by encountering these boys with all kinds of unexplained symptoms and circumcising them. And then supposedly, suddenly, the symptoms disappear. And it was very much also bound up in this idea that masturbation was also thought of as, a major cause of illness. But there's a weird, some of these doctors basically had this idea that if boys were masturbating, it was because the foreskin was irritating them and they were innocently trying to kind of, rub the foreskin, and that led to them masturbating. That was kind of one line of thinking. And the other was a bit more explicit in thinking like circumcision will prevent these boys from doing the naughty thing of masturbating. So that's its origins, basically in this kind of weird Victorian anti-masturbation hysteria. And then over time, I don't go into the subsequent history of it as much, but basically with the invention of germ theory, the foreskin then becomes associated with this potential site that harbors lots of germs. And so that became a new justification for circumcision. And now today we have justifications kind of rooted in different ideas about sexual health that
I want to ask you an interesting question. I think as a young man, I had a stereotype, which I will confess to, which is that I thought that uncircumcised penises were ugly. Why did I feel that way? Like, why?
There's a Sex and the City episode about this.
I'm sure there is. Yeah, I haven't seen it, but where does that stereotype come from?
Well, I mean, It is, so I'm based now in the UK in London, and that stereotype certainly doesn't exist here or in Europe, more generally, because uncircumcised penises are the norm. Circumcision is associated with a Muslim or Jewish religious practice, or something went wrong with your foreskin, so they had to do an operation. So I think it is largely to do with whether it's a cultural norm or not, and what sort of sticks out as different. But also this idea has been promoted and probably unconsciously like suffused itself into you as well, that there's something a bit dirty about the foreskin, and particularly the kind of I apologize to your listeners who might not want to hear about this, but the slightly like moister mucosal environment that the foreskin creates, and that's exactly what the doctors in the 19th century were concerned about.
What do you make? This is by now a standard Lacanian Slovene school trope of otherization, which is that otherization in part emerges from a form of enjoyment envy of the other.
It sounds like you have a better theory then.
Well, I mean, I think it's compelling. Don't get me wrong. It's really coming from Lacan, and it's just refined by the Slovene school kind of most prodigiously. But my question would be, that actually is exactly what the foreskin does, is that it gives the male subject who has not had it cut off, they derive more pleasure from masturbation. They derive more pleasure in sex. Is that at play here?
Well, I would say that your certainty that the male, I apologize, but your certainty that the male subject does derive more pleasure from sex if they're uncircumcised is precisely that theory of the other enjoys more, like inaction. Because that is exactly what anti-circumcision activists are obsessed with, this idea that they're missing out on something that uncircumcised guys have. And there's not, I mean, yeah, you could
You're saying
posit
there's no compelling scientific argument that one could derive here for that claim?
There isn't really. I mean, that's
Really?
the thing. When you wade into the literature on this, of course, the experience of sexuality is so subjective, and of course, you could say maybe there's a different kind of physiological sensation if you have a foreskin or if you don't. But whether that leads to better sex is really in the realm of fantasy.
Look, you've caught me mired in my own fantasy. You've caught me. I'm interpolated. This is like what Althusser meant by interpolation. I'm in it. Oh no! See, Jordan, your book is already doing miracles by bringing people out of this. Oh my goodness! Wow. So then, what is the origins of this activist group, the inactivist movement?
Intactivist.
Sorry, not inactivist. I knew that. Intactivist.
Yeah.
Which describes it pretty straightforwardly.
Yeah, I only corrected you because it is that word intact is so central.
I remember reading it. I looked at it double time. I'm like, is that inactivist or in? And I thought in my head it was inactivist. That's why I made the slip. But nonetheless, where does it emerge from? Give us its prehistory. In a way, it sounds like an example of, does it really elevate to the level of a serious activism? I mean, I don't want to take anything away from their principles, but at the same time, it's kind of like, is it a kind of postmodern thing in a way? Like, kind of like, for example, I had a friend who tried to run a prank campaign, and this is not a prank, I know that, but like in the UK, where he put on the ballot the category of Jedi for like a presidential race, and he tried to like promote people voting Jedi, and like he actually got like tens of thousands of votes as a protest.
Sure.
So it's obviously not farcical. There's a sincerity absolutely at stake in the intactivist movement. But where does it come from, and what is its core? What's its platform?
Yeah. I think the question of whether it's a real form of activism or not, I mean, it can be equally applied to all of these kind of fringe quasi right-wing movements or outright right-wing movements like incels and the alt-right and all of that kind of stuff. And in a sense, intactivists were a lot more fringe when I started writing this than when I finished the book. And they had, gained a bit more, Andrew Yang, the presidential candidate, kind of declared that he was aligned with the intactivists, and they gained a bit more of a public profile. And so do seem to be, and I think some of their arguments have, have reached the mainstream. So basically, it would be hard to date them exactly, because there are lots of kind of more rational skeptical arguments made about circumcision, running through 19th century, 20th century to today, saying maybe we don't really have good reasons for routinely chopping off boys' foreskins. I wouldn't necessarily call that intactivist. What is intactivist is these people who believe that there's a kind of conspiratorial, anti-male, anti-sexual motivation behind circumcision, and typically someone who identifies as an intactivist, and this term has been in circulation for at least 30 years or so. Is someone who believes, if they are circumcised themselves, that they have been robbed of something essential to their masculinity, and also something, they've been robbed of a certain kind of pleasure, and that this isn't recognized as legitimate by society, even though often they will say there's this kind of double standard of, we accept, in mainstream liberal society, that FGM is really bad and it robs women of pleasure. Why don't we accept that circumcision is the same thing? Those are the kinds of people that tend to identify as intactivists. They tend to be very angry and very kind of single issue focused, like this is the thing. And that was actually, I talk about in the introduction, that was sort of the psychical motivation for this project for me to begin with. Was I just encountered a few of them when I was a high school student, and was sort of taken aback by their sort of anger around this subject. And also I was kind of interpolated in this moment because I had never really thought about circumcision as anything significant, even though it had been done to me. And suddenly I saw these people who really believed that this was this gigantic, human rights crime. And I had to think, well, what does this really mean to me? I didn't really think this was a problem.
Yeah.
But just one thing I would say about their kind of political relevance. I mean, I do think there's something quite postmodern about it. And I do think it's sort of, although they're not the same thing as, incels or the alt-right, there is a kind of conspiratorial thinking at its core in intactivism that does seem to me like something that it has room to grow in the absence of a more robust left-wing critique of capitalism. I think that's the place in which these more conspiratorial theories of basically like, why am I dispossessed? Those flourish in a space where you don't have a more robust way of identifying what it is that dispossesses us.
That makes sense. But I wanted to ask you, when I was reading this, one thing I wanted to ask you, and I think you mentioned a little bit here, is can you talk about its birth concurrent to the rise of a crisis of the paternal function, and a crisis of Oedipus, and a crisis over the paternal function in the family as well? Because there's a kind of a Janus face going on here. There's the enjoyment piece, and there's the male, the downgrading of the status of men in society, or the perception of the downgrading of the status of men, which of course we can link back to a big debate within psychoanalysis around post-Oedipal, pre-Oedipal, crisis of Oedipus, etc., etc.
Yeah.
Isn't that also a huge factor here?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, it is very much a movement, that is sort of decrying the loss of male status. And yeah, it could be seen as linked to, the Lacanian idea of the loss of the paternal function. I mean, I know that's something you've kind of worked on as a theme. Maybe you could elaborate a bit what ideas you had that relate to that.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's the symptoms of the crisis of Oedipus are symptoms which I track in several ways. One, as a tendency that is built in and inherent of liberal political theory as well as capitalist deterioration of social bonds. There's something there that must be thought through. Of course, I actually spend less time speaking about the ways in which it creates a crisis of masculinity, in part because I think that a lot of feminist theory that I sort of reference in my book already addresses that much more rigorously than I could. I was more interested also in understanding how, if there's a crisis of Oedipus and the destabilization of the kind of traditional Fordist family, Oedipus paradoxically transfers to institutional sociality. And so you sort of have a kind of weird hangover of unresolved Oedipal dynamics within the workplace, within corporate life, within the university, etc., which I think is something that a lot of Lacanian and psychoanalytic theory doesn't really address head on. So our institutions, in a very broad sense, are dealing with the impasses that have kind of emerged from this. And I don't have an answer to it per se. I just try to track some of its effects. And I think this is a good example of one of them. I think the other one would be on the theme of initiation itself, as a general device of a crisis, which Lacan tracks in his later work as well. Don't you think that the notion, and you see this a bit in Betelheim, if we take just a general insight of Betelheim, that if the subject is saying, in fact, I'm the purveyor of my own initiation, that I have the kind of the wherewithal and the means to invent my own initiatory options. And this is maybe one way to theorize transsubjectivity. That's very postmodernist. The law is being imposed by the subject. And I think that here, the affirmation is something like that. It just happens to be taking this form of ideology. It doesn't have to take that form of ideology. And that's where the Marxist thing comes in, because there's a different ideology that could be introduced here. And that's actually why I feel like, like I was interested also in those subjects who, what I call non-subjectivity, subjects who actually are deprived of initiatory opportunities. Precisely, what do we think about subjects who have to invent?
Yeah.
Well, that's actually now the postmodern a priori itself. That's the position, is everyone should, and that's actually funny because I gave the choice to my son and myself.
Yeah.
So that is a very, I don't like the word postmodern, but I do feel it is kind of a postmodern condition that we're dealing with.
Yeah. And it does come back to the anecdote about your son, because one of the things I say in that last chapter is, okay, so these intactivists are having this kind of reaction to circumcision as, this thing that has stolen enjoyment from them. And it's a kind of misplaced, sense of dispossession.
Yeah.
But I also argue that, so it's very interesting to the number of people who feel extremely conflicted when they have a son about whether they should circumcise their son or not, particularly if they're of, Jewish or Muslim heritage, or if they're American and it's kind of considered the norm. But, there's I've encountered lots of very secular Jews who, never, practice any of the, never really celebrate the holidays or practice any of the rituals, but nevertheless, when they have a son, like, this is a big thing. Should I circumcise him or not? And often there's a sense of like, I really ought to do it. This is, this marks something important, and not to do this would be this giant betrayal, even though I otherwise don't really care about my religion. And in some sense, I think there's the same problem going on there of this, idea or fantasy that circumcision will secure something symbolically that in our postmodern society we really need to secure, because we have very few, mechanisms to initiate ourselves into society, and this whole, sense of everyone has to kind of find their own way to belong, because we don't have, this big other in place. So I think the same thing is often at play with people who do circumcise their sons, in this kind of anxious way, is like, well, maybe this is the thing that will, like, offer some anchor in this unmoored world.
Correct. That's exactly right. And the fact that it takes on this kind of these reactionary hues is a question of political of the absence of a political alternatives that, and yeah, in a way you could say, well, the left should see an obligation to offer some alternatives there. Although that's interesting, because I also feel like perhaps a lot of liberals would say, well, it's not really up to us to go in there and kind of like, that's actually one of the interesting things apropos incels, which is
Hmm.
like there is a sense in which the discourse on the incels, they've already established their non-status in the discourse. Like there's nothing really redeemable about them.
Hmm.
I'm not sure that the intactivists are that onerous or that odious, right?
Yeah.
Um, so that's a whole other thing about maybe um, a certain hysterical structure of our discourse that we could talk about later. Um, well, Jordan, I want to respect your time and conclude by asking you something I always ask my guests, which is, are you continuing this line of inquiry? Do you feel like your work here, Circumcision on the Couch, is kind of a complete project for you? And are you moving on to other areas of research? And if so, what are they?
Yeah, thank you for that. I do think that I'm done with writing about circumcision more or less for the time being. I mean, now that the book is out, I do get requests to like write a little article here or there about it, but it's not a major research project anymore. I'm a bit tired of being the circumcision guy, although now I do need to speak about the book, so I have to do a bit more of that. But I am very much still interested in questions of the body and psychoanalysis. And what I'm working on at the moment, it's really early days, but I've been hired on this research grant where I'm doing some kind of ethnographic work with a clinic in the UK that treats young people who are questioning their gender identity, and for some of them offers them medical interventions to transition. It's a kind of exploration of what goes on in that clinic, particularly what goes on with questions of time. And I'm using a bit of psychoanalytic theory to try and parse through what's going on there. But I don't want, I think, gender identity and questions of transition are very different from circumcision, but of course they both are things that concern the body. And so that's a theme that runs through my current work.
Brilliant. Brilliant. And you host the New Books in Psychoanalysis. You're one of the co-hosts of that podcast, right?
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, and at some point in the hopefully not too distant future, we look forward to having you on
Hey, we'd love to.
our
Yeah.
podcast. Yeah.
Yeah. No, that would be great. Well, listen, this has been really fun. You're always welcome back to chat about your upcoming research and your just all of your interesting. I mean, you share a lot of interests, I think, theoretically and even now politically as well with what we're up to here. So it was a joy to chat with you. I thought this was a lot of fun, and I think that I actually learned quite a lot by engaging your work. So congratulations on the book, and kudos to you for writing it. It's just, as one thing I didn't mention is like a lot of work went into this text. Like it's clear. You put a lot of work into this. So that's, bravo. It's a really nice job. So
Thank you, Daniel, and thanks so much for your really thoughtful and generous questions as well. It was really fun to have the conversation.
likewise. Okay, my friend. We'll talk soon then.
Okay.
All right. All the best.